If you're watching this, you likely care about how software decisions are made at the big tech level and how one programmer can shape the entire industry. This video reveals why Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux and Git, never trusted Microsoft's strategy, what he objected to, and why even today he keeps the company at arm's length. In the early 1990s, Microsoft was selling proprietary closed-source Windows, tightly controlled by licenses and patents, while Linus was building a free open-source operating system kernel called Linux. Those two projects were growing in parallel, but they were built on almost opposite assumptions about how software should be written, owned, and improved over time. From Linus's perspective, Microsoft's model wasn't just different, it was structurally opposed to what he valued. He saw an operating system that was poorly understood even by its own engineers, held together by workarounds, and allowed to rot as long as it kept selling copies. In one of his most famous critiques, he said that internally Windows was a complete mess, where nobody dared fix bugs because it might break 100 other programs, and that Microsoft's primary interest was making money, not building a clean, reliable system. To Linus, that approach felt like a betrayal of what an operating system should be, something robust, transparent, and maintainable by those who use or contribute to it. Microsoft's strategy, in contrast, prioritized features that could be sold, user interface polish, and market dominance, not the underlying architectural integrity of the system. That meant design decisions were often made to support compatibility with existing applications, even buggy or outdated ones, rather than to simplify or stabilize the core system over time. Linus grew up in a Unix-influenced environment where the system was expected to be legible, predictable, and easy to debug. In that world, well-defined interfaces mattered more than flashy features or aggressive marketing. When he looked at Microsoft's trajectory, he saw an ecosystem where the code was treated as a black box, where customers paid for access instead of understanding, and where the company's incentives nudged it toward complexity and lock-in, not clarity and openness. That's where his distrust took root. He didn't hate Microsoft because it was evil, but because its business logic and engineering culture were built around lock-in, opacity, and short-term commercial gains. Exactly the opposite of what the Linux community was trying to do. In Linus's view, Microsoft's strategy was about preserving control over users and vendors, while Linux's mission was about giving control back to the people who ran the software. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Microsoft's strategy extended beyond just selling Windows. It was actively trying to contain and undermine open-source software. The company pushed proprietary standards, filed or threatened patent lawsuits, and spread what Linus later described as fear, uncertainty, and doubt around Linux and other open-source projects. In no uncertain terms, Linus accused Microsoft of using FUD tactics because it couldn't compete on price with free software. He argued that Microsoft's real weapon wasn't technological superiority, but its control over standards, licensing, and customer expectations. To Linus, that wasn't just bad business, it clashed with the philosophy behind Linux. Linux grew through collaboration, shared code, and a merit-based community where anyone could inspect, fix, or improve the kernel. When Microsoft's strategy was about controlling what customers could see or modify, Linus naturally saw it as a hostile force, not a natural partner. There's a reason he once quipped that Microsoft was not evil, just incompetent. He wasn't defending the company, he was rejecting the idea that Microsoft's actions were driven by some noble principle. To him, Microsoft's strategy looked like a clumsy, money-driven attempt to maintain dominance, even when that meant blocking innovation just to protect its cash cows. So for years, Linus's distrust of Microsoft's strategy was straightforward. Microsoft's playbook was to keep everything closed and proprietary, and anything that threatened that, like Linux, had to be weakened, legally, technologically, or perceptually. The turning point came in the 2010s when Microsoft began publicly embracing open source. The company started contributing to the Linux kernel, open-sourced major tools like .NET, and even integrated Linux into Azure, its cloud platform. These moves weren't small gestures. They signaled a real shift in how Microsoft positioned itself in the software ecosystem. Linux was no longer an outsider or a threat. It had become the backbone of data centers, cloud workloads, and many modern services, and Microsoft couldn't ignore that reality any longer. On the surface, this looked like a complete reversal. Microsoft was now running Linux on its cloud infrastructure, paying engineers to contribute to Linux, and making parts of its own stack available under open-source licenses. From a purely technical standpoint, a lot of the friction Linus had once criticized was being replaced with collaboration. Instead of patent lawsuits and FUD campaigns, there were pull requests, code reviews, and contributions to shared projects. Microsoft even joined the Linux Foundation and became a major financial backer of open-source infrastructure, which would have been almost unthinkable in the 1990s or early 2000s. But here's where Linus stayed cautious. He publicly acknowledged that Microsoft had changed, that the engineers working on Linux projects seemed genuinely happy, and that Microsoft's public behavior was actually more amicable than in the past. He didn't dismiss the progress. He recognized that Microsoft's engineers were now active participants in the same technical communities he helped build. Still, he treated that shift as a practical adjustment, not a philosophical conversion. Yet, he didn't suddenly trust Microsoft's long-term strategy. In interviews around 2019, he said that the old anti-Microsoft rhetoric had become more of a joke than a serious concern. But he also made it clear that every company, including Microsoft, wants to influence Linux in its own interest. His stance was never that Microsoft is evil and will destroy Linux, but rather, Microsoft is a big company with its own goals, and we cannot assume those goals align with the open source community. Linus saw Microsoft's open source moves not as charity, but as a different, more pragmatic stage of the same corporate strategy, adapted to a world where Linux dominates servers, cloud, and embedded systems. In that sense, Microsoft wasn't abandoning its core incentives. It was simply responding to a new reality where open source and Linux had become too big to fight. Even as Microsoft became one of Linux's biggest contributors, Linus remained wary of any single company gaining too much control over the kernel. He stressed at community events that no one, not Microsoft, not Google, not Red Hat, could take control of Linux by themselves. He wasn't worried about Microsoft hijacking Linux in a dramatic sense. He was focused on the quiet, long-term risk of a single corporate agenda slowly bending the project's priorities in one direction. His attitude was less about blocking big companies and more about making sure the process itself stayed neutral. His point was structural. Linux is built on a decentralized, merit-based review process. Changes go through a network of subsystem maintainers, public mailing lists, code reviews, and ultimately Linus himself, who still has the final say on what goes into the mainline kernel. No corporate board, no PR team, and no cloud product roadmap can override that workflow. That governance model, in his view, is the main safeguard against any one company, including Microsoft, turning Linux into a proprietary tool or a glorified extension of a single vendor's stack. Linus also pointed out that Microsoft's engagement with Linux is heavily shaped by Azure. The company invests in Linux not out of pure ideology, but because Linux is what runs most of the world's servers and cloud workloads. Microsoft's strategy in this light is about optimizing its own infrastructure and services, sometimes in ways that benefit Linux broadly, like improving performance, security, or scalability, and sometimes in ways that mainly serve Microsoft's own cloud business, such as tweaking the kernel for specific Azure workloads or tooling that keeps customers locked into its ecosystem. So Linus's lack of full trust isn't about hatred or nostalgia, it's about reading the incentives. He's seen Microsoft's incentives shift from trying to crush Linux to trying to co-opt and profit from it, and he still doesn't assume that Microsoft's long-term strategy will ever match the community's long-term goals. To him, Microsoft's contributions are welcome, but they're still contributions from a corporation with a balance sheet, stock price, and competitive pressures to answer to, and that's why Linux needs its own independent, community-driven process to filter and guide those contributions. Underneath all of this is a deeper philosophical gap. Linus doesn't just engineer Linux, he embodies a culture where code is open, bug fixes are transparent, and users are treated as collaborators rather than locked-in customers. Microsoft's strategy, even in its modern open-source friendly form, still revolves around selling products, services, and ecosystems. Its embrace of open source is real, but it's also selective. Projects that support Azure, Office, or Windows get the most attention, while broader community-driven goals sometimes take a back seat. Linus acknowledged this when he said that Microsoft today is not the Microsoft of 20 years ago, but he also made clear that its change was driven by the market, not by some internal moral revelation. Linux forced Microsoft to adapt, and that's what changed its strategy, not Linus's personal opinion. So, from his point of view, Microsoft's shift is a response to competitive pressure, not a conversion to open-source values. He's pleased that Microsoft now contributes useful code and eases its patent stance, but he still doesn't treat Microsoft's strategy as inherently aligned with the long-run health of Linux or the broader open-source community. The practical outcome of Linus's distrust is that Linux has stayed genuinely independent. No single company can dictate its roadmap, and Microsoft's influence is just one voice among many in the kernel's governance structure. Linus's stance also influenced how the community approaches big corporate players. When Microsoft started contributing more, some worried about taking over Linux. Linus pushed back, saying that every company wants to rule Linux, but none of them can. That attitude has helped keep Linux resilient. It's open to corporate contributions, but it reserves the right to say no when those contributions don't align with the broader technical and community priorities. And in that sense, Linus's long-standing mistrust of Microsoft's strategy has actually been a protective mechanism, not a limitation. For end users, whether you're running Linux on a laptop, server, or embedded device, this means that the core of Linux is still governed by a culture that values transparency, technical merit, and long-term stability, not quarterly earnings or cloud market share. Linus Torvalds never trusted Microsoft's strategy because he saw it as fundamentally built around lock-in, short-term profit, and control, values that clash with the open, collaborative, long-term oriented culture he built around Linux. Even as Microsoft changed and became one of Linux's biggest contributors, Linus didn't throw away that skepticism. He adapted his view, but he never assumed that Microsoft's strategy had become selfless or aligned with the community's best interests. So the takeaway isn't that Linus is stuck in the past. His distrust is what has kept Linux independent, open, and still very much alive in a world where Microsoft's strategy keeps evolving. If you found this useful, consider liking the video, subscribing, and dropping a comment with what you think. Do you believe Microsoft's current open source strategy is genuine, or is it still just a competitive move? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.